sort of really struck me listening already that the report hasn't really resolved how what starts with psychoanalysis ends up recommending clinical psychology, and we might want to return to that. So, colleagues, I really find myself asking of this report, as of many similar other reports, what is the purpose of a psychological account? Does psychology really merit the position of privileged insight that it's so frequently and increasingly assuming in relation to social problems, whether it's debt or unemployment, homelessness, poverty? Can a psychological account really do anything more than reinforce the inexorable rise of psychological fundamentalism, the relentless pursuit of psychological answers to political questions? A project that is not only a job creation scheme for therapy and the therapy industry, but also, I think, serves to obscure institutional psychology's ideological leanings, and I won't put it any more strongly than that at this stage. It's a paradox, isn't it, that as material inequalities escalate, the gaping chasm between rich and poor in terms of income and wealth, so the pursuit of non-material explanations for inequalities in health, employment, crime, education, and here debt becomes more frenzied. And it's a paradox because, as this report makes very clearly shows, the origin of problem debt lies in poverty or reduced income, and the events that push people into poverty or reduced income, in the absence, as we have just heard, of either private wealth or a social safety net. Job loss, illness, benefit cuts, sanctions. As with other political problems, there's a very familiar social gradient when we look at debt. Even so, the report can't quite avoid a familiar moral discourse. So people struggling with debt seek advice. They don't willfully refuse to get help. They're responsible. They're willing to take action. They're also suffering. And I'll return to why I think that's crucial. So the same attempts to reclaim the fallen are evident in many psychosocial reports about the deserving poor, the unemployed who are eager to work, benefit claimants who are so genuinely sick and disabled they're practically dead. Gaining sympathy for the victim becomes the kind of primary function of the life story. It's a well-meaning strategy. It's one I've used myself, and probably all of us here have been involved in some way, defending the underdog, the vilified, the objectified populations marked out for wearing out, as Lauren Ballant so aptly describes them, demonstrating that it's not their fault, in order, as this report puts it, to get policymakers to learn to empathise with those struggling with entrenched financial and psychological problems. Entrenched, like complex, always signals the imminent arrival of a psycho-solution. So, what I think is going on here is psychology as a broker of deeper understanding. I think it's a flawed project. It presupposes that the major problems that we face, poverty, debt, inequality, the low pay, no pay economy, the housing crisis, are the result of some kind of false consciousness on the part of elites, whereas power surely is at the heart of the matter. Which means that the testimonies on debt that we might most want to seek out are testimonies not of suffering, but of resistance. Can't pay, won't pay. Bringing debt into the same frame as political activism and direct action on housing, on workfare, a living wage, benefit cuts, you mentioned the bedroom tax, austerity rhetoric, and so-called welfare reform. because as this report also shows, households take on ever more debt as public services and welfare provision are scaled back. I think there's another problem with all this psychologising, with terms like financial melancholia and spirals of debt and depression. What to do about diagnosis? Because, as we know, it's not like diabetes. You can't pee in a bottle and have the matter decided one way or another. So to link debt and depression suggests that depression is an uncontested category, and clearly it isn't. And then we get stuck in a familiar cycle, a familiar circle. So it goes like this, people who are poor with few assets to fall back on are much more likely to have mental health problems. People who are poor with few assets to fall back on are much more likely to get into debt, are much more likely to have mental health problems, are much more likely to get into debt. Ditto homelessness, low education, unemployment, etc., etc. And in this context, how helpful really are insights from clinical psychology? If debt is primarily an issue of social justice, then I would suggest on past performance, I wouldn't expect to find institutional psychology at the forefront of the struggle. My own research, and I just want to make some closing remarks to put my bitterness in context. My own research in partnership with Robert Stern has been concerned with the misuse of psychology in various government workfare or work for your benefit programmes. And I've been looking at the role of psychology in three areas: in activating unemployed people in various mandatory change your attitude courses, the role of psychology in explaining unemployment and classifying the unemployed through the use of constructs like psychological resistance to work, employability, job readiness, cultures of worklessness, etc. And finally, the rise of psychological conditionality, which is where feelings, beliefs, and personality become a factor in deciding benefit entitlement and entitlement to other resources, for example, cheap food. So you need to be motivated to make a positive change in your life to get groceries from community shop. Compulsory positive effect, not to mention the misappropriation of the word community. So psychological insights underpin this shift from what you have to do to get benefits to what you have to be. And what you have to be is something called employable. And that isn't a set of skills or attributes attached to a specific job or job offer. It's a generic upbeat state that demonstrates an appropriate psychological profile, how to achieve a mindset that appeals to employers, as one course for job seekers puts it. A set of rather narrow, approved characteristics, you'll be familiar with them: optimism, confidence, enthusiasm, motivation. In the latest development, psychological therapists are going to be located in job centres, along with supported online CBT for a group described as claimants with mental health problems. The DWP deny that treatment will be mandatory, but the Tory manifesto suggests otherwise. People who might, I quote, people who might benefit from treatment should get the medical help they need so they can return to work. If they refuse a recommended treatment, we'll review whether their benefits should be reduced. Colleagues, all this means that curing unemployment is a growth market for psychology. Let's hope curing debt doesn't follow the same path. Thank you.